I think the Prime Minister, if we're serious about this, and cabinet ministers should be walking around in their vest pocket with a list of those 20 projects and pulling it every day and saying, is it on the rails or is it off the rails?
Canadians might disagree on a few things, but lately we all seem to agree on this one. The idea that Canada needs to get moving on some big nation-building projects that'll boost our economy and also enhance our sovereignty. So the federal government is creating this new major federal project office. It vows to slash years off of approval times, and provinces have been quite eager to propose key projects. Energy pipeline building, once the third rail of Canadian politics, suddenly in fashion again. Cue urgency around the Ring of Fire, a project that has been decades in the making. Well, last month, PPF released a report called Build Big Things, and it highlights the urgency of the mission and offers a pretty detailed playbook of how to get it done. It also found that advancing some 500-plus resource projects to final investment decision, as it says, could generate up to $1.1 trillion in cumulative GDP growth. That's a 4.5% boost to Canada's GDP, and it happens by 2035. We're lucky to be joined now by two of the authors, Jay Khosla and Yiota Kokkinos. Thanks to you both for being here.
Pleasure.
Great to be here, Amanda.
Let's start with the big numbers because they are big, they're eye-catching. How do we get to the 500 resource projects and that 1.1 trillion? Was that surprising even to you? I'll start with you, Jay, that we landed on that kind of a number.
Well, yeah, I'd actually, when we started going, I didn't expect that. I knew that we needed significant investment, and I think that's really the thesis behind the entire report, so I appreciate you starting there. The question becomes, how do you get big projects to financial close? And then, what does it take in terms of investment numbers? And we now know fully from this report that we don't have the capital requirements that we need to get these projects done, but it's good to have that data point. And so the next question is, where does the capital come from and why is it not here? And I think at the top level, we just got handed a gift in that regard, which is from our neighbors to the south. We've talked endlessly about Donald Trump's impact on the country. Right now, what is it, 100% tariffs? Are we moving in that direction on everything? And so that really is a wake-up call for us. And so that's point number one in terms of a call to arms of getting capital back into the country. I think the second and equally big point is that we've not really focused on GDP growth. So you mentioned that as a country lately, we've really focused a lot on different sectors of the economy, but not targeted it. And now is the time for us to do that. We rank second last in the OECD in the last 10 years in terms of per capita growth. And we need to set a different market. I'm really glad that the Prime Minister and others, the premiers, are thinking about that. Time has come. And so how can we boost that up significantly? Well, these projects will help do that. I think the final thing, and third, is that we've really focused on a consumption-based side of the economy, meaning services, and we'll always do that. That's where the whole economy is pivoting to. But Canada's big. It's endowed in natural resources. So when you think about energy, mining, forestry, agriculture, all of these things, we need to supercharge them and move them forward. And these projects underlie all of that. They can get those things done. So yeah, let's focus on getting those projects forward and getting the investment dollars flowing, which have dried up.
When we talk about 500 projects, there are some big ones that most people could name. How do you actually land on what those projects are? How exhaustive is that review and how deep do you go into the Canadian economy to arrive at that number?
So the 500 projects are in Natural Resources Canada's projects inventory, and they include the full range of projects from clean energy, transmission, oil and gas, small modular reactors. So it's the full range, and they're all at different stages of development. The projects that are going to come forward, that the Prime Minister has asked the provinces to bring forward, are very much of that nature as well. We've got projects that will unlock our natural resource potential, but we also have some critical infrastructure projects related to ports, for example, pipelines to get oil and gas to tidewater. So it is the full range. The government will have to articulate criteria for which projects it decides to move forward. It did, coming out of the FMM, provide some criteria. Those are closely aligned to what we recommend in our playbook around economic growth, environmental responsibility, around energy security, and of course, Indigenous economic participation.
So let's talk about, for people that aren't familiar with the report, they can go get it. They should. But the policy framework that sets out these 4 pillars, and I want to drill down into them and they'll happen. They may happen in different stages. I think our assumption will be if we're going to get things done, they're going to happen in a coordinated, simultaneous fashion. But you've got coordinated financing, efficient regulations, critical infrastructure, and Indigenous participation. And Jay, you mentioned sort of the financing piece. I'm going to come back to that because to me, that's actually one of the big question marks hanging over Canada right now. But just in terms of the pace of those, how do you think they need to roll out to get us moving as quickly as everybody seems to suggest we need to move?
Immediately. Like, I'd almost want those projects to be named now. I would argue that we have a window, maximum 4 years, to move on this. And then things might return back to where we were. And that's how we got here in the first place. We're a bit complacent. And so maybe to use an example, I think always helps. I think about the LNG Canada project a lot in this space. It was 2 years under regulatory review. That's a huge project to get done in 2 years, but it got done. That's the environmental assessment side. But what some people forget about is that the government actually gave a hand financially. Not a whole lot of taxpayer money, but it gave some. And both the federal and provincial governments worked in concert to ensure that that thing got to financial close. And we went into the books and we found, hey, we can provide a nominal amount of funding. $250 million for infrastructure was provided. BC brought its carbon rates down, and the federal government brought its manufacturing tax rates down. And all of that mega project, the single biggest investment, $60 billion in the history of the country, hit financial close and is now about 6 months away from producing something. So these things need to happen fast, and they need to happen in concert, like you said. And I would also argue that actually has the support of Indigenous people. So another good example, if I think about Crystal Smith, head of the Haisla Nation out there, she talks a lot about how her community has been brought out of poverty, and finally enabling infrastructure. Some folks may think this is too technical, but there's a pipeline that serviced that production facility that needed to work in concert. You can't have one without the other. So yeah, let's do it. Let's bring these things together and let's do it quickly. Maybe even through an office of sorts. Yeah.
So as these reports go, this one's quite detailed. And in the first step, you offer, a series of policy recommendations. It felt to me like maybe you gave an advance copy to the government because a lot of that playbook is unfolded. They have created recreated the Major Federal Projects Office. They have met with the premiers. They are putting lists together. Yiota, we don't know what the list is. And the Prime Minister has promised to be quick about it and come back with it. That, of course, is going to be a pretty big piece of this in many ways, not least keeping the provinces happy, right? Because we do have this interesting country where as much as we have kind of federal nationalistic fervor right now, provinces do often compete. And that might actually just remind them that they're in competition for resources. So how important is that list, and how important is it that we get it quickly?
The list, of course, is hugely important. The fact that they're focusing on growing the economy, that's job one. The fact that they have set a goal to be best economy in the G7, an energy superpower, I didn't think I would hear that. The fact that premiers walked out of that June 2nd FMM, all saying, I can't remember the last time we had a meeting just on the economy, I think is striking. It was a take-pause moment for me, which tells me that they are definitely on the right track for sure. So while they are putting in place a lot of the things that we talked about, we think they need to go a little further in some areas. For example, if the project list, however long it is, and it can't be too long, we would argue. There are a few things that we think where they need to go a little deeper and maybe just expand things. I would start with this major projects office. Right now, it looks like it's going to be focused on coordinating the regulatory assessments and the permitting, which is great, but we think it needs to go further. We have developed this 4-point framework, which talks about bringing together the financing, the regulatory piece, the enabling infrastructure, and of course, Indigenous economic participation. These are 4 distinct functions that we feel need to come together under this one office with the related expertise to get these projects through the system. Regulation isn't the only thing that's going to get this through.
Let's talk about financing because we are in an interesting geopolitical moment. I don't think, want China to underwrite the Ring of Fire, and we may not welcome U.S. capital the way we might have a year ago. Depending on what that structure looks like, and of course, speed's not your friend when you're trying to, maintain control over these things. Jay, what's your concern or your thoughts about where the money comes from, and do we have enough of it to achieve the ambitions you're laying out? 500 projects worth more than $1 trillion. That takes a lot of capital.
Sure does. And at the end of the day, we want to focus and be disciplined and rigorous and targeted. And so that project list, as Yiota said, we should focus on the first few, because what I would argue in the short term, we're going to have to provide some assistance federally and provincially to get these things up and off the ground. Not a whole lot of taxpayer money, but things that can catalyze. And so that's where you really need to understand what's making these projects tick on a financial basis, what gets them to financial close. And not all of them are the same. They maybe don't need financial assistance, but I would argue, that governments need to come together. And right now, federally, we have this alphabet soup, what I call an alphabet soup of granting agencies. We can say them together if you want, but I think about the CIB, the Infrastructure Bank, the Clean Growth Fund, the CGF, EDC, BDC, FCC, SIF. We can keep going. That capital stack needs to be put together and targeted at these 20-odd projects where they need financial assistance. The second thing is, in terms of foreign direct investment, you're right. We may not want the U.S., but whether we like it or not, they're going to come. But Trump has actually siphoned away investment dollars with his tariff actions. And that is pretty dangerous. So these projects become even more integral to get market access for us, right? So that's why they probably deserve a little bit of help from governments, because once we get that market access, folks will start to come back. And I think that's the ultimate goal. The final outcome has to be that, private capital comes back to this country as dried up by every measure. The World Bank says that. We're number 26 in terms of ease of doing business. So in the short term, a little bit of government assistance, which has always been the case in this country, large land mass, small population. But ultimately, let's get the Japanese back here. Let's get the Germans back here. These are places where they want to be here. And they've been crying to be here. And we haven't made it easy for them. Even the Koreans, I would say the Indians, all of that can come back. But right now, they're not looking at us as a place of choice at all. Last thing I would say is I really love this example. BHP, an Australian super major corporation, its CEO is Canadian. He made it his mission to invest in Canada and did not have an easy ride. But luckily, we got the Jansen potash mine, a recent $4 billion investment that hit final investment decision. And that's because he cared. And he's from Vancouver. And so it shouldn't be that attracts capital. It has to be that we're making the business conditions right to get this done.
So one of the things that you just mentioned, and if there are words that are easy to say and hard to implement, it's a whole of government approach. We always like to say that, whole of government. When we think about just those organizations you listed, the many that can be involved in project regulation and finance, then you take that, of course, to government departments and the way that they operate, even when they've been tasked with working together, how difficult it can be for the government to kind of really flatten. Do you have a sense from this government that they might have more of an ability to do that than in the past? Because it's a hard thing to do. People have tried before, and it is difficult.
Yeah, I'm sure Yiota will want to supplement this, but I really like what Yiota said off the top. which is they're setting all the right markers for now at the highest level. At the political level, the markers are there. And that is a big condition for success. They haven't been here for now because the bureaucracy reacts to how the politicians dictate what they should do. When a prime minister says, and when Yiota and I were there, we know this like the back of our hand. When the prime minister says do something, people do something. So that's right. Okay, so step one, accomplished. Now, underneath that, Amanda, you're quite right. Lots of other things need to happen. And we've had a little bit of success in the past. We had the Major Projects Management Office. It was targeted only on the regulatory system, but it was a cross-government exercise at the deputy minister level that brought 12 deputies together on a monthly basis. You think about the momentum behind that, right? And they would review projects on a monthly basis to say, hey, where are these things not working? What do we need to change? How can we quicken the pace? That creates, a cause and a spirit. But I would argue right away, the bureaucracy has lost its perhaps entrepreneurial spirit a little bit in this space. It needs to change its culture away from risk aversion. That's point one. Point two, coming back to the NPMO, siloed approach. So we would argue that taking away the silos between the financing, the regulatory, indigenous, and enabling infrastructure has to happen. And so, and then maybe meeting monthly. And then I think the third thing is actually the expertise. Anytime we've had success in this country, at least federally and provincially, governments have actually worked with proponents, good proponents, to get into their books and see, where can they help? Because nobody wants to give a big cash handout. That's not what this can be about. You can't put taxpayers at risk, ratepayers at risk, but you can provide a little bit of assistance to move projects forward. And I use the LNG Canada example. I would say the Jansen Potash mine is another good example where we provided $100 million for infrastructure, and it's up and running. At the end of the day, though, you really need to understand what makes these projects tick from a financial basis, and that's deep expertise. And I don't think the bureaucracy really has it all right now. We need to invest in that space.
Yeah. And if I may add, Amanda, really, given what's at stake, we don't have the luxury of business as usual. The federal government, and I would say the provincial governments, are going to have to organize themselves and make this their top priority. If there's anything that governments do well, is try and advance too many priorities. People get distracted, things don't get done. I think we saw what's been happening the last few years. So this has to become everybody's job one, and good governance around moving these projects forward is going to be really important. A cabinet committee that oversees these projects moving forward, the deputy committee that Jay talked about, hugely important. They really have to re-engineer how they're going to operate.
I really like that. I say this a lot. I think the prime minister, if we're serious about this, and cabinet ministers should be walking around in their vest pocket with a list of those 20 projects and pulling it every day and saying, is it on the rails or is it off the rails? I think that'll get the job done.
I joke darkly in recent times at what a relief it is that we've solved climate change. Because it does feel as though the whole Western world has, because we had this intense focus on it, have put it on the back burner. We're kind of done with that for now, and it's not really the kind of subject you can be done with. Where does that fit into these major projects? And I say that obviously an energy superpower can be many things, and I think, of course, we do mean green tech. We mean the critical minerals that will fuel a green revolution. We mean all of that, but of course, we're starting with natural gas and oil. That's the low-hanging fruit for Canada, and I just want both of you to kind of like square that circle for me of how the people who are still out there saying, remember net zero, remember the environment, and I'm among them. How do we get there and achieve our goals as well?
Terrific question and great point. To me, that's the saddest part of the story. But it's not just that investments dried up in the oil and gas sector. People point to that a lot. It's actually dried up across the board. Like, we had all this regulatory apparatus passed in all these years, expecting that there would be more money flowing into the electricity system. It's actually stagnant. And that's shocking. When the RBC says we need $2 to $3 trillion in this space and we're flatlined, that's a problem. So we're not getting the job done in any space. So that means our efforts on climate change and the energy space are not occurring. In the mining space, where we need the critical minerals, you talked about the Ring of Fire off the top, we need those critical minerals to decarbonize. It's not happening. I think about the Pathways project in in Alberta. That's a carbon capture storage project. We've been arguing about that for 4 years now. We can continue to do that. But the main point is, if we don't have this investment and we don't move these projects, we do not decarbonize. It's as simple as that. And there's a lot to be done. Transmission lines at the top of the list. Yiota, over to you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Jay. And in the Build Big Things playbook, we really do address this issue, actually. I know everyone is seized with oil and gas and pipelines, but that's not all we're talking about here. We are talking about moving forward those critical projects that we need for the energy transition to decarbonize our energy systems here in Canada, to develop the technologies, not only to meet climate change commitments. But these are technologies like the small modular reactors, like the carbon capture and storage, that then we can go on to sell in international markets. These are technologies that everybody wants. So yes, we may end up building a pipeline. Yes, we may get more oil to market, because I think we absolutely need to decarbonize the global energy system. But let's not forget, we need these investments to get more, to electrify our own energy system and decarbonize it.
We, of course, know that the Prime Minister has long held views and a commitment to the concept of net zero. One of the things that could give us pause is this notion of having the government, any government, picking the winners and the losers, as we always like to say. We have a very recent example on the electric vehicle space, particularly in Ontario, of billions of dollars promised. And it was maybe too early and maybe mistimed and maybe the wrong technology in the end. It's one of those things. Where in kind of your thinking is the possibility that we get it wrong at this major projects level? And again, I will say probably we can't do that with an oil and gas pipeline. We know the world needs that stuff, and if we can get it to market fast, there's a market for that. The minute we venture into, which critical mineral is it that we want to exploit and why, we're in new territory of this could be a wrong bet. Are we worried about that?
I actually think that's a bit of the problem. I think that's what's been our focus to now, is that every time we kind of get something off the ground, let's use the pathways example again, people just start to argue about, is it the right thing to do? I think you're right, though. We can't just walk into this blindly. But there's a reason provinces are bringing these projects forward. They've done their homework. And I think federally and provincially, we need to come together like we did in LNG Canada to say that's a viable project. We got to get deep in the books and make sure we assure ourselves. And I'm not sure how much diligence was done on the example you use, but I do know we can do the diligence. I know for a fact we can work with mega corporations in the world. We've done it several times. So that's the second point. We really have to reassure ourselves financially very quickly. And that's why that expertise we talked about, integral to the process, and not just at the federal level, but also the provincial level. And then the last thing I would say is that even if we do hit some losers, I look at the Muskrat Falls Lower Churchill example in Newfoundland, which went into cost overrun by 2, or the Hibernia example out there. We invested in both those projects. Ironically, in the end, and you can almost see this happening on TMX coming forward, over a long period of time, even if they are mistakes in terms of cost, they seem to handsomely pay off. Hibernia has. Lower Churchill, people forget, it went into double, but it is now decarbonized Newfoundland's electricity system. How can you monetize that? Secondly, it probably unlocked the deal between Quebec and Newfoundland going forward. And that, to me, was one of the biggest problems that the country faced in this space. So, these things pay off in many different ways.
Yiota, do you have thoughts on that?
I would just add, Jay's absolutely right. And, I know people get into the picking winners and losers, but the alternative is do nothing, create nothing. And secondly, I would say, these are going to be the projects that get chosen are the ones that are actually economic. There's a need for them. There's a demand for the product. So I don't see how that can be a losing proposition at the end of the day.
So I guess the argument might be that and you guys get into this, and I want to talk about it. The critical infrastructure piece seems to be the place where governments historically have played the best role, and just logically play the best role. They're big, complex, multi-jurisdictional projects that you really do need the kind of social capital to get done. And to me, if they were going to start somewhere, it would be, and it goes actually to your point a little bit, Jay, we can't do anything in this country if we don't have enough electricity at hand. So the grid is surely one of the most important things we can do. That's not super sexy. There's not an immediate return. I mean, you can see why people would look at projects that just have better headline appeal. But will we get it wrong when actually, making sure our roads are drivable is important for our economy in a way that's hard to measure. I mean, are we going to focus well enough, I guess, on that infrastructure piece, which is probably the least interesting politically of all of them?
Well, I would say if you look at the way the government has approached this, by asking the provinces to come forward with their top five, if you look at, well, we got hints of what was on the provincial lists. They are all major infrastructure projects. They're not private sector projects on that list. And that makes sense because you need to put the foundational infrastructure in place. And then those private sector projects, energy, critical minerals, will come forward if they know there's going to be a road to get to the mine, if they know there's going to be a pipeline to get to the port, or there'll be a port to actually ship your LNG. So, it's feeling like a bit of a phased approach, but I think it makes sense because you do need that foundational infrastructure in place.
I really like the premise to your question, Amanda, and I'll say just a couple of things quickly. One, on the transmission lines, yeah, totally not sexy. Great point, but totally necessary, and I'll tell you why. Here's a fact that probably many Canadians aren't aware of. We've run out of clean hydro. We're now starting to be net importers. Who would have thought that in a country that was so blessed? The province of Quebec, big exporter of hydro, and now is trying to build 150 billion worth of new projects almost in a decade to deal with the fact that they have no more capacity. Same with BC, same with Manitoba. So those transmission lines can create efficiencies in that space, and that will help. I think the second thing is on infrastructure. You don't do all of this. You don't do the Ring of Fire without looking at a planned exercise, right? You have to look at it as a systems kind of oriented situation. So if we were lucky enough to get that one critical mineral mine up and running, if we have a lag port like the one we have in Vancouver that takes 10 months before any of these products can get to market, that's a real problem. Why did you do that? So yeah, absolutely look at it from both sides of the equation. And I'd say the last thing is, if there's one project on the infrastructure side, it's got to be some port out west. We need a new port or an expanded port. We're congested way beyond belief. And to me, on that list of projects, that has got to be there. Like whatever it looks like, we can discuss, but it's either Roberts Bank Terminal 2, which is a project that's out there that are thinking about to expand in the Vancouver region or somewhere else in BC. That has got to be thought of as a nation-building project.
So let's get to the human capital piece of this, because that's, I think you've landed us there. I mean, one of the, you probably pay more attention to this than most people, but people will be aware that, the terminal workers are periodically threatening to strike, and they have done over the past few years. And one of the big issues that their union is bargaining around is replacement by technology, is the digitization that we need to have happening at these ports in order to do exactly what you're talking about, which is greater efficiency. So that's the human piece. By the way, we're losing that. We've lost that battle so far. They've protected their jobs. That's a human piece. And that also brings us to, and I'm lumping them together, although they don't belong together particularly, but the human piece that is the relationship with Indigenous peoples. Because again, we can point to our success stories, and they're wonderful, but we got 600 nations in this country, and they do not agree on many, many things. There's not one voice. And so it's the people at the end of the day, I think, that will be the challenge here. And do we have the capacity and the foresight to manage through that?
On the Indigenous piece, I would say, and whether they support a project or don't support a project, it really will depend. It's not, the projects are not a one size fits all. There are over 600 First Nations communities, as you said, and they don't all feel the same about resource development. Some are very pro, like we've seen with the Khosla Nation, that are really pushing forward. Others are not. But I would say that it's a huge opportunity for those Indigenous communities that want to get involved in these projects. What they're asking for, which is what we heard during our consultations, is engage us up front, and not just on consultation, but on how we can actually participate in these projects economically, including having an equity stake in these projects. And so there's tremendous opportunities as well with the Indigenous peoples on the labor front. A lot of these projects are going to need skilled labor. So lots to do there, including capacity building for Indigenous peoples to participate in these opportunities.
Jay, there is that old saw that you can either have something done, two of the three, right? Fast, cheaply, and well.
Right.
Pick two.
Right.
The fast part, as I hear Yiota talk, which is, of course, so important. And every time we've seen a success on Indigenous partnership, it's been around trust. It's been around shared ownership. It's been around ownership at every level, not just equity ownership. But those things take time. And we're sort of talking with a sense of urgency, and I wonder how we make that work.
But we also have success in this area. And I think that's the thing we don't nearly focus on enough. I met with the Australian High Commissioner the other day, and she was asking me, how did we get in the last decade sort of almost pivot right around on many of our relationships with Indigenous peoples compared to them? And I think if we look at the last 10 years, one of the big offshoots, one of the most positive things is these relationships have started to happen, and they've really happened through our regulators. Our regulators have gotten a lot stronger in this space. 10 years ago, they didn't even want to play in this space. I mean, I'm talking about the federal regulators in particular. And so those relationships are starting to emerge, and best practices are starting to emerge. We've codified them. The TMX and LNG Canada examples are good ways forward. So there are ways to do that, but you're right. It starts early, but it also starts with a conversation not just about impact, but also about participation, as Yiota said. Like, economic participation is key. We heard that Indigenous peoples are super confused with the way the federal government's approaching the economic participation piece, just almost as badly as the developers are with the alphabet soup of what we're talking about. Like, they just don't know where to go. And this is why a single office that can develop those relationships, and with a stick-to-itiveness, with a mindset of discipline, going out there and understanding that no, it's not about getting to yes, it's more about how do we participate together, will help. I actually love to think about practical examples, and we didn't do enough of this in the report. Maybe our next deep dive will, but we do talk about this. I think about a place like Cigar Lake in northern Saskatchewan. It's a uranium mine. It's up there, and it's fully Indigenous owned, run, and operated by Cameco. I think about the Watay Power Project in Northern Ontario. It's a transmission line, again, fully owned and operated by Indigenous peoples. And frankly, your question speaks to a bigger issue in my view, which is we just do not have the labor in this country at this moment in time. If we were to say 20 projects, look out. And you can just see where it's happening. In BC, they're saying 20 projects, and yet they've got all this other LNG stuff on the go. They're going to have a huge labor shortage. So this talks about planning at the highest level, like Yiota said right off the top. A cabinet committee needs to take that part seriously. It also almost talks about re-engineering the whole economy, an industrial plan. I know people get allergic when you say those kind of things, but you want to think about the next decade of what the workforce looks like. That means working with universities. It means working the immigration system. There are elements way beyond what we've outlined in the report that need to be integrated in this if you're really thinking about solid planning.
As you were going through this lengthy process that produced this report, where did Bill C-69 sit with you? And was there ever a moment when, one recommendation is rewrite that bill in order to get this stuff done?
Well, no surprise. It was on the top of every industry stakeholders list. And so we all know that. But we believe that even within C-69, it is possible to move these projects forward. And, BC shows us the way. They signed a cooperation agreement with the Impact Assessment Agency to take over the environmental assessment of their projects. And that's fast tracking the projects that they have identified. So there are flexibilities within existing legislation that could be leveraged. I think that includes Bill C-69. Sure, I am sure there are improvements, and I think we're hearing that the government is open to possibly making some improvements.
Amanda, I think the saddest thing that could happen here is repeating, I guess we'll call it the definition of insanity, which is repeating the past. So we've had two successive governments take a run at environmental assessment legislation as the problem. And what have they done? They spent, like, in those 20 odd years, 15 odd years, slowed down the process, things are not moving, et cetera, et cetera. So if we make that the focus again, and we argue this in the report, we'll be losing more time. And frankly, one project, one review can happen. There have been reviews under all pieces of legislation, either the past or the present, that have occurred in 2 years. I look at the offshore in Newfoundland as an example. There are projects there that have been reviewed now. People don't know this in 6 months. And that's because we've gotten really effective out there. And I talked about LNG Canada 2 years. I think about the northern leg of the Keystone XL pipeline. It's unfortunate. That's probably the single most significant piece of infrastructure we could have ever built. It never happened. But the northern part of it was done in 2 years. So we can do it under existing sources. If they want to tweak it, that's fine. Don't make it the focus.
Okay, so we have a lot of momentum. As we're talking here, the government has, as I said, it looked as though they had an advanced draft of your report. They've implemented a whole bunch of things. They're moving fast. What are you watching? I'll start with you, Jay. I want you both to answer this. What are you watching with concern? In other words, what would happen that would make you say, uh-oh, we're going off the rails. We're going down the same old tracks. This whole new spirit of cooperation and urgency is getting lost. What should we watch for?
Yeah, okay. I'd say one technical and one more strategic point. The strategic point would be the Fed-Prov dynamic. I'm watching that very, very closely. Yeah. There has to be a spirit of cooperation in this space, both between federal provincial governments, but also multilaterally across the country. Like, I like what I'm seeing on internal trade as an example, right? All of a sudden, premiers are waking up and signing these agreements. Well, in this space, they should be doing the same, coming to some sort of, brokering of deals. I think that's kind of what we're talking about. I think at the more technical level, we've already talked about this a lot, but if the federal government, in setting up this whole new set of processes, does not envelop the 4 points in and come up with, like, SWAT teams, for example, on each of these projects, that's what it takes. Like, at least, and I'm not talking about huge bureaucracy, I'm talking about 3 or 4 people, 5 people that are accountable, dedicated to each of these projects, especially on the financing side. That will be a big mistake, and I'm concerned about that right now.
Yiota?
Well, I'm going to be watching for some early wins. I think we need them. I think we need a couple of projects to actually go through this process because it's going to send a huge signal to global investors that finally Canada is open for business. You can invest here and see your project through. I think that's hugely important. And I'm also going to be watching this 2-year regulatory process. You know, I started government 33 years ago on the top of every stakeholder agenda, on the top of every new government that has come in. Regulatory reform has been on the top of the agenda. It's 2025 and we're still talking about it. If there's a will, which I think there is now with the new PM, we really need to break through and not do it just for the test case will be this initial list of fast track projects, but then we need to move on to change the whole system. And we have to do it. We absolutely have to do it. The economy really is at stake.
I think a lot of Canadians would agree with you on that. I am going to actually finish with this, and maybe this is not the most positive note to end on, but from both of you, a lot of this goes to system capacity. It goes to mindset, of course. We've got super smart people, but this Prime Minister has promised to cut government spending by limiting department spending below the rate of inflation. That's a cut, and it's a change in what we've seen. Are we outsourcing this capacity? Are we managing to look at department by department? Are we changing the engines on a jet in midair? I guess is what I'm asking, because we're trying to fix government while we're trying to do big things, and it feels like a lot.
I love that question. We've gone through rounds of cuts in the federal system several times, so they know how to do that. And they're probably lining up to get that job done. They should anyway. It needs to happen. I think And more importantly, though, the outsourcing point is significant. I think in-housing this and developing the expertise in this area is paramount. At the end of the day, there's two things that need to happen. It's not just the downsizing or the right sizing of government. It's also growing the economic pie. And as sometimes we forget about that. In this space, we can grow the economic pie, so it's worth the investment. And I also don't think, finally, Amanda, that we need to have a hiring spree in this space. There are existing resources within these institutions. There are key departments working in this area. Finance has expertise. Enercan has expertise. Innovation Canada has expertise. All of those financial institutions I talked about, they have people. We need to bring them together, centralize them, and get them under the Prime Minister going. And let's go. And I encourage people to read our report is my last point. Please read it. Please go through it, especially decision makers out there. My plea to you is what we're talking about is real and can happen. So thank you for the question, Amanda.
Yiota, last word to you.
I totally agree with Jay. We've got a world-class public service. We have the expertise that we need, but we need to bring them together. It's very dispersed right now. The accountabilities are dispersed. We need to line things up. Yeah, we might have to go out to get some very specialized financial expertise, but the bureaucracy has what it takes. It's all about how they organize themselves to deliver.
We got to leave it there. Thank you both for being with us. Really appreciate your time.
Pleasure.
Likewise, Amanda. It was nice to be here. Thank you.
We've been talking with Jay Khosla and Yiota Kokkinos. That's WONK for this week. Thanks for being with us.